It's loading. All right, I think we're live. So hey everyone, welcome to the Innovating in Quantum Computing panel. And my name is Peter, and I'll be your host. So I'm a junior who is majoring in math at Stanford, and my co-host Matthew will join sometime in the middle to help with questions. And we have three amazing panelists with us today, and I think we'll all learn a lot from them. Throughout the discussion, if you have any questions, please put them in the Twitch chat, and I'll be looking out for them. First up, we have Cesar, who is the Chief Scientific Officer of StrangeWorks. Prior to StrangeWorks, he worked at Harvard University and the Max Planck Institute as a theoretical physicist with a focus on quantum computing. He has a PhD in physics from the University of Texas in Austin and a bachelor's of science in computer engineering. He has 20 years of experience, and I'm excited to hear what insights he has. The Puerto Rican natural affirms that the universe is made of quantum information, and his job is to hack reality. Thank you for joining us today, Cesar.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Stefan, who is the global startup lead for IBM Quantum, where he manages both the startup program and partnerships with QC startups. Prior to IBM Quantum, Stefan earned his PhD in physics from Yale and also developed go-to-market and growth strategies for clients while at the Boston Consulting Group. And lastly, we have Michael, the CEO of Q-Control. He is a professor of quantum physics and quantum technology at the University of Sydney, and he's also the chief investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence for Engineered Quantum Systems. Mike completed his master's and PhD at Harvard University, and he has also worked as a consultant for DARPA, helping steer government investments in quantum information and next generation computer architectures. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
My pleasure.
And without further ado, let's jump into the questions. So, Cesar, how do you envision quantum technology shaking up our world today?
So something important to understand about quantum technologies is that we are at the very early stages. We have to think of the early stages of computing, which means it's very exciting to be part of this, but we have to wait a little bit to have monetary value for it. However, I think everybody here we're working towards building up towards that, and of course, like many people are participating in this conference, they're joining because they see there's a career paths, there's a lot of kind of opportunity, and it's just very thriving and exciting. And of course, as things keep developing, there's going to be many areas of impact. Quantum chemistry and materials is it's the one that everybody always think about, and it's for very simple reasons. That these are all quantum problems, and it's very easy to map them directly into a quantum computer and simulate them. You don't have to do approximations for classical computer, get errors, and put it back in. And of course, things like that are going to have big implications for pharma. So you can model whole medicines and so on without having, before you go to the lab and get your hands, you put gloves on your hands and things like that. And there's, of course, a lot of, in finance, optimization, search, and a lot of other areas as well, and so on. Which ones are going to happen first, and so on. It's a little more nuanced questions, and I'm sure like the other panelists, we can comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, Stefan, I'm curious, with the startup industry, what kind of exciting work are startups doing right now, and how can they help accelerate the field?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question, Peter. And we have lots of startups that are doing exciting work within simulation, AI/machine learning, as well as optimization. And essentially, we know that where the state of the industry is right now is that the hardware is playing catch up, right? So you'll have startups that might be doing exciting works at the fundamental algorithmic level, which is also very exciting. And then you have startups that are trying to address that issue of, how do we take the devices that we have today and be able to do meaningful work on them? Now, startups are approaching that in two ways. So, there's the startups that are actually, building the hardware themselves, trying to make bets into their different types of architectures, whether it be superconducting, photonics, ion traps, etc. And then you have startups like Q-Control who are, taking the devices that we have today and seeing if, like, on a firmware/software level, what can be done with these noisy devices to improve their gates fidelities, for example. And also there are other startups that are figuring out, okay, how do we figure out more ways to compile a circuit to a specific hardware architecture to actually do good work. So overall, I would say that, this is just startups are doing many different things, and it's all at addressing that one big question, which is how do we make sure that the field as it exists today is going to provide value in the future.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Yeah, Michael, maybe you could talk a little bit about what Q-Control is doing with regards to that.
Sure. Thanks, Stefan, for the intro there. I appreciate that. Q-Control is a company that focuses on a discipline called quantum control. Control engineering is the discipline that makes everything work. It makes airplanes fly and walking robots and drone technology. It makes all of that work. We focus on applying those generic concepts to the different challenges that emerge in quantum systems. A lot of the rules are different. Obviously, everybody knows that when you measure a quantum system, you destroy quantum superposition. And so most of the fundamental tenets of conventional or classical control engineering have to be rewritten. Now, we do a lot of work in quantum computing. So most of what we've done in this field so far has been demonstrated, or a lot of what we've done has been demonstrated on IBM's hardware. We've shown that we can use quantum control in order to make the quantum logic operations, the fundamental constituents of the algorithms, more robust against the reality that these systems are imperfect, right? That they suffer from calibration errors and they suffer from things that change over time. We've done some work on using AI agents to automatically create new gates that outperform the best human design gates on this hardware. But then we also actually have a whole business practice which is focused on quantum sensing. So making new kinds of sensors that leverage the same kind of physics. For, in our case, primarily we're interested in geospatial intelligence, and we can make things that behave much better, again, leveraging quantum control.
Wow, that's really cool. And maybe for someone who's unfamiliar, what's like control engineering with regards to quantum computing?
Yeah, so again, remember, control engineering just makes stuff work. And so the most familiar example I think most people will know is something called feedback control. If you've ever driven in a car with cruise control is a feedback system, right? You measure how fast you're traveling, and then you try to adjust your speed automatically to hit a target. Now, in quantum systems, as I mentioned, the kind of measurement that you would typically do is destructive and problematic. So we will focus often on something called open loop control, which means how do we make a system more stable without actually measuring it? Now, this is a bit tricky, but there's another familiar example. And that familiar example is like a sprinkler system for your lawn. Right? You can live somewhere dry, and you can have a beautiful lush green lawn by having a sprinkler system that comes on at noon every day. Right? It doesn't measure if the grass is wet. It doesn't measure if it rained last night. There's no measurement involved. It just comes on a cycle. And if the cycle is set right, you can stabilize a dynamically unstable system. So, that's a pretty, crude analogy, but in quantum technology or in quantum computing, we use similar physics. It's physics that's been validated for decades in NMR, for instance, nuclear magnetic resonance, in order to make quantum systems more stable and more robust. And for anybody who's heard of quantum error correction is really just a form of feedback stabilization that uses a very fancy technique to make the measurements indirect.
Awesome. Yeah. So, Stefan, so this kind of brings up a question of we're working on hardware versus software. So what do you think some of the most promising fields for quantum computing startups? And what areas need more talent in your view?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because the way that the field is, at that 30,000 foot view, is that there still is need for talent both across hardware and software. Now, when we look rather at hardware startups, that they are doing things that involve coming up with using different physics to to basically have different QPU architectures, and in those fields in particular, like there are still lots of like scientists, experimentalists that are needed to really push the field forward. I think that is an exciting place to be. But however, you can see it if you take the lens of a startup CEO or co-founder, you can just imagine that going into the hardware game, requires a little bit more capital. It requires, like a lot more investment in terms of just what that money is to build up that lab, to build your prototype, etc. And and the ability to rapidly iterate and to pivot, maybe is a little bit more, let's say, more constrained when you're dealing with a physical system. Now, I think in the software, if you look at the other part of the industry and you look at the software startups, I think that's, they also do need lots of scientists who can understand, how to do development in, the various SDKs. You need to understand also how from a, like, if I take the example of StrangeWorks, how do you take quantum platforms and actually democratize it and actually make it available to a large number of users? That's needed, in addition to the actual quantum science research. So I would say that that is also in the software startups. That's also a very exciting place to be in. I would say that it probably opens you to more options, just as my bias and my personal opinion here. And in terms of just lowering the barrier to get into, there are, I would say, if you take out the capital, etc., maybe there, just for someone wanting to start something in quantum, maybe that's a place that they could consider because of, not necessarily needing the fabrication, the labs, etc.
Yeah, awesome. Cesar, how yeah, so that you guys are doing like some amazing work helping democratize quantum computing. How is that going?
These leverages to what Stefan was saying before, that there's a lot of hardware, there's even more software options and so on. A lot of these tools are open source. A lot of these tools are developed by startups like Mike's startup, and a lot of these tools are just developed by scientists and so on. So what we're trying to do is do the engineering work that needs to be done to make sure all these tools fit together, work together, and they're easy for people to deploy. If you just have one thing that you want to do, maybe that's, you can spend the time and invest a lot of time just trying to get this code running. But as things keep changing, a lot of all the software is evolving constantly because we're really early stages. A lot of it breaks compatibility regularly. So we're trying to do all the engineering around that. So each person, wherever they belong in the software stack, they can really focus on what they're good at and don't have to worry about the other stuff, essentially. So this is something about being early. It's an early industry, and there's a lot of moving parts. So we're trying to make it easy for people to not worry about that and focus on what they're good at. And a big component of that is our open source community, which is quantumcomputing.com. It's all free, it's open source, and I encourage everybody to just go play with some code there, write your own quantum programs, run it in simulators, and so on. And so a lot of what we do is really focusing on making sure the connectivity with the hardware works fine, making sure all these other software tools work fine, so people can build their quantum solutions as they need them.
Yeah, awesome. Maybe transitioning, Michael, what milestones do you think we'll see, and what should we look out for on the road to like really practically viable quantum computers? Because Google proved a while ago, 2019, like quantum supremacy, and there's some debate about that. But when can we see like quantum computers that are really like proving like practically valuable for companies in different fields?
Yeah, I mean, what you're getting at is a topic that sometimes is called quantum advantage. It is distinct from that notion of quantum supremacy, or whatever one prefers to call it at this point. Quantum advantage is really focused on when it is practically relevant to choose a quantum computing solution versus any alternative, right? Any conventional alternative, as opposed to in some very esoteric problem that does not map to a practical need. When is a quantum computer better, right? So that distinction is important to your question, because even though we have achieved this first milestone, we haven't achieved quantum advantage yet. Right now, most of the industry is focused on, or most of the user base in industry is focused on accessing early quantum computers, for instance, from our friends at IBM or others, in order to become ready, in order to train before they have advantage. Now, really, there are two things that need to happen, two primary things. There's a lot of things overall that need to happen on the orchestration side, as Cesar was just saying, et cetera. One is the systems need to grow, right? So we know broadly that the systems need to be, of an order of magnitude bigger than they are today in order to potentially achieve quantum advantage. Now, fortunately, industry roadmaps say that by 2023, we're looking at up to 1,000 qubit machines, right? And it's possible that with that scale, we may be able to achieve quantum advantage if the second thing happens, which is the hardware improves dramatically. So this is a two-sided coin. It's not just how many quantum devices you have, it's how good they are. And right now they are pretty terrible, right? And it's not, I build quantum computers in my academic lab. So this is not a jab at hardware companies. It's really hard. But it's important to understand the scale of difference here relative to conventional machines. In your laptop, the one that you're probably looking at this on, the transistors in the microprocessor can typically run for about 1 billion years at 1 billion operations per second and never be likely to suffer a hardware failure. And in a quantum computer, that number is more like 1/1000th of a second, right? So it's a completely different scale. It's about 24 orders of magnitude difference in terms of this error rate. And so bringing down that error rate via various means is one of the key things that has to happen. Now, we do that primarily at this firmware level, where we're using control to drive up the performance of the individual logic operations. You can add to that quantum error correction, which is this algorithmic approach in order to identify and then fix or compensate for the errors that do creep in. And then you can be clever about the way you build algorithms such that the algorithms may be more tolerant to the presence of some failures. Now, this is something that's broadly being studied in the problems that are, or excuse me, the algorithms that are being used for problems in chemistry and the like, these so-called variational algorithms. But you have this two-sided coin where you absolutely must make bigger systems and you must make them perform much better in order to cross over this threshold, the theoretical thresholds for making useful quantum computers.
Mhm.
If I may add a little bit to what Mike was saying. So what he was going to do is there's roughly speaking, there's 3 areas that quantum computers need to improve. Is we need more qubits, we need them to be more robust, better, and we need them better connected. We need them more connected to each other. All those 3 areas people are working, and all the different hardware companies right now, nobody can do all 3 very well. We need all 3 better, but what everybody's doing is doing compromises, and they're doing different compromises how this could work. And maybe through that, find a path that's scalable, that's good enough. So as things scale, we're gonna start to have tests maybe some of these compromises made are very good for some kind of application soon enough, soonish. And this is kind of like the logic of why we have all these hardware providers, and why it's also very exciting that there's a lot of options, because people are trying different things, and each one might be more suitable for different tasks at the beginning. Of course, later on, what we want is computers that are good at all 3. So this is what Mike was saying. It's very scalable, and then we're gonna be very confident of how much power is gonna grow, how fast. We're gonna have something like Moore's law, but for quantum. But we're not there yet. We still don't have the confidence that we know we have something good enough that we can scale.
Yeah, I'm curious what there are lots of different types of approaches to quantum computing on the hardware side. What kind of advantages do we see, and what like, what are some of the like key things that need to be advanced on the hardware side?
Anybody?
Yes, so I can take that question. Yes, I would say it's too early to call the race. Let's put it that way, and just on reporting numbers and so on. There's people are coming up with clever tricks all the time to use the the little that we have to use it for better. So I would say if anybody of us calls the race, maybe later we'll be wrong about some aspects of it, maybe on the ballpark of some others, but I think it's very very risky business. I do think that different hardware companies are taking different approaches, and some are making their computers available online for free, like IBM, for example, so people can go play with them. And of course, the benefits of something like that has is that they learn what the users need, what the users want, and they get a lot of feedback for that. Sometimes these technology races, they're not won by simple numbers, they're won by usability. There's other aspects of it. So there's like a lot to do before one decides. I think ultimately what's going to happen is there's going to be some point where the computers become more accessible and more valuable for many industries, and then ultimately the ones that are going to decide are the developers. It's the same thing. It's if you play video games, there's many different hardwares, but the numbers don't mean much, right? Sometimes it's the games, sometimes
Right.
it's the how easy it's to develop. So
Yeah. Sorry, and just to add to that. So, I mean, as Cesar is saying, there are a lot of factors to consider when you think of, scaling the number of qubits, connectivity, error rates, just, to name a few. And so, I mean, those different things will help to kind of decide in the future, like where we align in terms of what the powerful QPU technology is. Now, but in addition to that, though, we shouldn't really ignore the fact that there is, lots of work that needs to be done in terms of the classical electronics and how do you run your experiments, right? So, for example, running an experiment on one chip, let's say, you're taking some sort of hybrid algorithm, you're iterating over many different steps, that total QPU time may take longer on one chip versus another. So I mean, yeah, so that's a chip issue. But then when you think of just the classical electronics design, maybe there are ways in which we can engineer or send jobs to quantum computers in which you're not just, for example, like sending an algorithm over to a quantum processing unit, sending that over iteration by iteration at a time over the internet, and that causing a real lag and really blowing up your essentially your experiment runtime. So I think that's one area in which we just need to make more progress in terms of the classical electronics. And then naturally, you can think of also other areas of building your system and how you may need to have like faster switching for some of your classical electronics. You may need better waveforms, etc. And those can translate as well into better performance of your system over time.
If it's okay, I wanted to jump back actually to Cesar's comment. I totally agree that we should not be calling the race, right? It is way early, but there's another reason that I think is maybe not discussed as much about why that's a really bad idea. Doing that would be a bad idea. And we talk about that it's early and that it's not clear who's going to win, but this idea of the winner is kind of flawed, right? We collectively as scientists often think of the definition of the winner as like Intel, right? Like, we think about microprocessors and the way we ended up with one commoditized technology made by one manufacturer. Now, that's a 70+ year journey, right? We don't think of it that way. We think of it as, oh, well, obviously it's always been Intel. It was not, right? The machines that helped the British win the war were not semiconductor-based technology, right? They were mechanical computers. The machines that followed on, like the ENIAC, those were not solid-state devices. And yet all of them made major contributions to computing. Now, the fact that 70 years down the road, we ended up with one particular technology that's completely commoditized to the point where these things are at the dollar scale to manufacture. that is not necessarily the endpoint that we should all collectively have in mind when we're thinking about the evolution of quantum computing. Maybe we'll get there in 70 years, but for now, there are lots of different technologies that can make big contributions to the advancement of the field. Maybe it'll be one dominant technology for the next 20 years, and then maybe the 20 years after that will be something different. Like these are all possible outcomes for us.
Yeah, so that brings up, one of the questions we have in chat, which is like, if this isn't like a democratized kind of computing, like what, basically like, there's like, is there a potential for quantum computing to be used for evil, like with a quantum advantage? And like, would you advise students who are concerned about social good to consider going into quantum computing?
I mean, yeah, if the implication is that perhaps they shouldn't go into quantum computing because quantum computing is evil, then I would say that's a very bad reason to avoid it. My thesis advisor used to say anything that's useful can be turned into a weapon, right? Like a stick. So, there are tough questions about policy, about like how we prevent, proliferation of controlled goods and technologies that can be directly deployed for, military purposes or whatever. I think those are quite separate. And I know somebody out there will complain that this is a naive scientist perspective. It is not. I used to work in the Department of Defense. The fact that somebody has figured out you can do code breaking with a quantum computer that probably won't exist for another 30 years is not a strong reason to say we either should not go and develop quantum computers, or we should not encourage people to go into the field, right? I think, this is an extremely exciting technical area. There is no doubt that there are people out there who have interest in applications that are military based, but like everybody's calling in on Zoom and using the Discord chat and then Twitch and whatever. Like you're using computer technology that's used to hack power plants and do evil things. But we all collectively as a society need to figure out the balance, as opposed to making this like, is the technology good or evil kind of question.
Yep. And I do echo that point that Mike raised, in which this you can think of quantum computing as a essentially a tool, a stick. It is a stick, and it's really there is a lot of good that this can be used for. And of course, I mean, there may be malicious actors who may want to use the type of power that's unlocked by quantum technology for bad as well. It's essentially just a tool that that I believe will ultimately cause more good than bad. When you think of the typical issue that people raise about, hey, what does it mean for our information, and whatever information is that secure, if malicious actors can crack it, etc. I mean, moving forward, there are ways to ensure that your information is quantum safe, and these are ways to do it in classical algorithms that exist today. So I would say that this is a healthy debate to have. And as scientists, we should always be debating, we should always be having this discourse. But to echo Mike's point as well, this should not be a reason to say that I will not engage and I will not contribute with in this field.
Awesome. Yeah, I think those are great points. And yeah, I think a lot of our participants are curious about, how to get into quantum computing, and like, what are some of the best ways to be able to like contribute to even some of your guys' companies. So yeah, maybe, does anyone want to take that one?
Sure. I'm happy to start, but I guarantee everybody here will have something very useful to say, and also probably a little bit different. Q-Control hires people that come from a diversity of backgrounds. We have people who are experts in control engineering. We have people who are experts in, quantum computing device work, so building superconducting circuits or building trapped ion quantum computers, et cetera. We have people who focus on theoretical quantum control, machine learning, and the like. And then we have a whole team, aside from that team, like we have the world's largest collection of PhD level quantum control engineers. But then parallel to that, we have a whole team of designers and software engineers, backend developers, DevOps, everything. And so one thing that I think gets overlooked is that in our community, we'll talk primarily about getting into the field by being somebody who builds quantum computing hardware or somebody who builds algorithms for quantum computers. That's the general mental model that most people have. There's all these other technical quantum things that are out there, but then there's also all the opportunity for people who have a more traditional software engineering or design or marketing or communications background to contribute to the industry, because we're running businesses, and those businesses have many facets, not just the core technology. If it was just the core technology, then we're university research groups, right? So I want to encourage everybody to make sure that you pursue opportunities in the field if you're interested, and not worry so much about whether you specifically have the right background.
Yeah, and then maybe I'll follow on that with, we, like in this field, which is, pretty nascent, there are going to be lots of ways that you can enter, and, and we expect that there are going to, quite frankly, be lots of people with different backgrounds, and that's totally fine. Now, in terms of just thinking about like what the on-ramp is to get into this industry, I know that this probably might be covered in subsequent panels when people are talking about their path. But think about how do you jump in? There is, for example, online resources. There's the Qiskit textbook, or there are YouTube videos that you can watch that give introductions to quantum computing and coding in Qiskit. I feel that kind of gives you a good preview of what it's like to write an algorithm and actually send a few lines of code to an actual quantum computer. And then from that, just like see where your interests really align, and whether or not you'd want to build more in that algorithm direction, and just think about expanding your skill set and digging deeper into whether it be online type of summer camps, or like other like webinars, etc., that can just give you that bit more of information. Now, I believe strongly that it takes a village to really like raise let's say like raise your interest or your knowledge in this field. And to that end, I think the quantum computing community is quite vibrant. So please, whether it be on LinkedIn or through Slack, etc., or whatever your online community is, forge those connections. And because from connecting with other people, you'll build upon a network where you get information faster. You'll also get an idea of what's happening in the field and where it is going. And then also you may just see people who you might want to be like, or that's in a role that you're interested in, because through that you can contact them and figure out what their path was or is. Yeah.
Yes, and just to suggest a few other on-ramps at different stages. Like, of course, I mentioned quantumcomputing.com. You'll see a lot of examples there, but there's a lot of links to things like the Qiskit textbook and so on. And all these, we just compile like a lot of resources. So this is, if you're curious, you want to see if you want to get into this and learn the basics. But of course, just as if you have programming skill, this is already very valuable. Our friends at Unitary Fund, for example, is an open source foundation of code needed for quantum, for example. And a lot of the stuff it requires some physics knowledge, some doesn't, and some requires translating physics code into real code that can be used by real people. So there's a lot of opportunities, and these are things that are, for example, suited for engineers and software developers. Like it's not just quantum physicists. And I suspect that although we always think of, we need a lot more quantum physicists, we want to grow this industry. I think that's true, but of course, what we all hope is that there's a point that we start to see things changing and it becomes more and more engineering. That's going to be a signal that that things have matured. Of course, like we need to get this out of the lab and into use. So as this happens, of course, like everything that you need for any kind of product, it's going to be very important, and it's going to be a fun ride until then. Yeah.
Sorry, Peter, you have muted yourself.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so that's awesome. We have one question in chat about like what role do like big consulting companies have on like getting a quantum computing ready workforce. So I know we talked generally about it, but Stefan, would you maybe want to talk a little bit about what role consulting has in quantum computing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that it's probably twofold. So one is, like, how do you think about as a consulting as a consulting company working with a client, how do you ensure that client has the right personnel at the right skill levels in order to support a quantum computing effort at that company? That's one. And then the second thing is also just thinking about, okay, as a consulting company going to a client that I'm going to assume has been doing a classical line of business, and to turn on their lights, etc. They have been primarily working on something classical for many years, and they want to identify where could they either figure out new revenue streams or think about how does quantum computing fit into their business. So on that second point, that's more along the lines of use case development. So can you, for example, take some sort of problem that the client has today and map that to a model that utilizes the capabilities of quantum computing, knowing very well today that, okay, maybe you aren't necessarily going to be doing anything better than that client would be doing classically, but at least setting the seeds so that as this hardware grows, as more and more people like advanced algorithms, etc., that that client is equipped in terms of the workforce as well as like what their use case is in order to jump into quantum computing. So yeah, I think it's essentially like really important, and it's essentially it's synonymous to consulting firms helping clients figure out what is their data and analytics type of strategy. How can they use big data in their line of business, for example.
Maybe I can add a slightly contradictory point. We've agreed a lot so far, so maybe it's time to not agree 100%. I think so. I also was a management consultant in the past. Consulting firms in this field have a couple of really important roles to play. They have the role certainly of taking that problem and mapping it to capability, as we were just hearing from Stefan. And certainly they are able to provide like a high level overview of where the field is and what is the status and what does a word like quantum advantage mean and things like that. I think the one point where I want to differ is I think we should not look to consulting firms as sources of primary source knowledge about quantum computing. We should make sure we keep in mind that for the most part, these firms are either composed of generalists or people with some education in the field, but who have not been expert practitioners for a long time. Now that's important, right? You don't necessarily want some dude who's been a crusty professor like me for 20 years, as the lead representative of the field to like a natural gas or oil company or something like that. You need a different kind of intermediary. However, I think one really important aspect of this is that when we look at reports that come out of big consulting firms, we should take a little bit of a grain of salt with it, right? Because they're written by analysts who try to get an overview of the field as opposed to being written by technical experts. And this is a very rapidly moving field. We've heard that before. Things change extremely quickly. The information can go stale very quickly. But more than that, it is a field that is absolutely ripe and rife with misinformation and misunderstandings. And resolving those often comes by integrating the people with deeper expertise in the community into those consulting projects.
Yeah, and to respond to Michael, I think that we aren't dissimilar in what we're saying. Like I do agree 100% that consulting firms should not be the primary source of information when it comes to quantum computing and what that means necessarily for like building your business per se. I also would like to yeah, and I also agree that there's lots of misinformation in this field, and what the consulting firms are might be saying, it's written by an analyst that for the most part a generalist, etc. I do think that there will be efforts by consulting firms in the future just to have people that are a little bit more specialized in quantum computing. So that will be a trend that will happen at some point in the future, whether that's decades away. Yeah, it's up for debate. But yeah, but as it stands today, totally agree with Mike. As it stands for the next 5 years, totally agree. And then 5+, they may want to, I don't know, like have a bigger role. We'll see.
Yeah, I think that that also brings up one of the questions we had in chat of like, how do you kind of, like there's a lot of hype around quantum computing, and I think Mike's already, talked about how some of the limitations, but would anyone want to like maybe talk a little bit more about some of the limitations and like what's more, maybe a bit more about reality and less hype, so to speak?
I'm happy to start off. I think one thing that's extremely important is that we need to make sure that we're always thinking about who is the messenger that we're listening to, right? If one is getting their news from media releases, then one should question those. Right now, the media releases from a corporate organization or from a nation state, right, are useful for getting an idea of what they are excited about and what they are doing. But it is not necessarily a objective statement of fact about the status of a technology or what that technology can do or how that technology compares to another technology in the field. And so, one of the hardest things that I've seen actually coming in part from the national security community is how much generalist analysts in national security will just pick up media releases, whether they come from nations or they come from companies, and report back what is in the release as if it were a refereed, peer-reviewed article. Right? They're not the same thing. And so I think one challenge for everybody who's watching and engaging with this field is to try to find trusted sources of information that are linked to or emerging from expert practitioners, as much as the generalist media, which does have a tendency to credulously report almost anything that comes out of certain organizations without a detailed technical dissection. And we all have to be a little understanding. It's really hard to parse who's right and who's wrong, especially when company A says X and company B says 1/X. And how does a journalist parse that? I don't envy them the task, but I would say that everybody has the responsibility, if they really want to be informed about this and want to cut through the hype, to seek out deeper and more technical sources of information. There are plenty out there. There are lots of people, on this call who contribute to open literature for a lay audience, for a public audience, not just technical material, to help give information about the field. I actually wrote a piece a couple of years ago called Hype and Cash, or Muddying Public Understanding of Quantum Computing. I've written for the national security community how they can navigate this. I think there are lots of us who contribute in this way, and I'd encourage everybody to try to find that information.
Yes, I feel like you're in Mike, and in terms of getting information from the news, because it's very difficult. I have a rule of thumb that it will filter out, I would say, like 95% of the news articles you see in the papers. If you take the word quantum, replace it by the word magic, and the information content of the article is basically the same, then you know there's very little in it, right? So that's like a simple one, and that will get rid of like a lot. We're like, oh, I learned the same thing by changing for magic. But of course, I saw a lot of stuff that's just overblown expectations for quantum computing. I do think quantum computing is going to be like transformative. It is the biggest thing happening in computing since computing. That's basically it. And there's going to be exponential advantages in some extremely important problems that are going to change how we do science and a lot of things. But also, it's not perfect at everything, and that's okay. I have no problem with that. People often talk about it as if they could foresee every possible future and do things with that. This is absolute nonsense. There's some limitations to quantum computing that are very well studied, and this is fine. It's going to be exceedingly good at some problems that are important, and it's going to be moderately good at some problems that are very general. And there might be some stuff that we haven't found out. Like this is the part I'm excited. Like there might be like a lot of more things that we haven't discovered how to use this computer for that. But it's not magical either. And so never trust someone that tells you like that it can look at every possibility and then figure out which is the best. This is absolute nonsense.
Yeah. Yep. I really like Cesar's story about substituting magic for quantum computing and and reading that. I think that there just needs to be a healthy amount of skepticism with certain claims, and I think on an emotional level, as human beings, we are wired to think big and wired to have a sense of FOMO, as if we are missing out on the next big wave, right? I have definitely felt FOMO for many different things that happened within the last year that I won't really cover, but essentially it's it's really, as Mike said, trusting the news sources, figuring out from whom you can get real information from. I tend to skew a little bit more towards academics and researchers. Even everyone has incentives to really show the best type of application, or what is that best path for quantum computing. I know that quantum computing will be incredibly powerful and useful to society, but I trust that academics and researchers are a bit more they're a bit more balanced in the way that they approach quantum computing and this industry versus versus other types of news agencies, etc., nation states that may want to put more spin on it.
I would like to I would like to take a guess, everybody here in this call. I think we're all extremely excited about quantum computing, and we think this is like a big deal. And we also don't like the hype. Like I think both can be true, because we think the impact is going to be immense, and there's no need to add hype to it. It actually hurts people's expectations. It hurts the timelines. We want to do the concrete work to get to the thing we promised, which is already quite grandiose and exciting. So in some sense, if you see people that like the hype a little too much, like maybe there's no substance behind it. And of course, in any exciting new field, the hype drives a lot of interest, right? And this can be good, but it can also be bad. And I would say with quantum, I think we all tend to lean like let's do the hard work, let's stick to the concrete stuff and get us there in due time.
Yeah, look, I think that's an extremely important point, right? That and it's not unique to the three of us who are talking here today. I mean, most of the people who are drivers of this field, whether in industry, academia, or large industry, startups, large industry, and academia, really want this to be a reality-based discussion. That there's so much to be excited about that we don't feel it's useful to push the boundaries. Now, coming from academia into running a startup, I personally had to learn more about, and I'm curious what the other experiences are like. I had to learn more about embracing risk and going for really big things, as opposed to managing risk down to zero, which is what you kind of learn when you're running an academic program. So like that's part of the journey. But all the same, there were a lot of VCs who were seduced, venture capitalists who were seduced super early, like many years ago, by quantum computing, with the image that it was like 6 months to a mobile application development, right? And that hasn't panned out, obviously, and it won't pan out. And so some of those venture capitalists are quite burned by the field. And that was an example of how hype has been net harmful. And hasn't actually, even in the short term, benefited certain players. So I think everybody wants this to work. Everybody wants, and you're going to get obviously a very optimistic viewpoint from the three of us and from others in the field. I would say, you don't always have to be the dour academic like I used to be, but all the same, like we have an obligation and we have a commitment to making sure that we're telling a true story about what is the pace of progress and what is hard and what is not. When do we really think we're going to cross these critical thresholds of quantum advantage and the like?
Yeah, Cesar, how is this similar in your experience?
In my experience with managing hype and expectations, or
Yeah.
No, so I also come from academia. Now I'm working in a startup, and as Mike said, it's very different. It's very different way that you approach risk. It's very different. Expectations, timelines are very different, and so on. How fast a project starts and comes to a conclusion is also a completely different thing. I would say the important part I always try to stress is that I think we all here because it's exciting, growing technology. And that is the correct reason to be part of it, because we want to be part of that. That still means we still have a long way before my mom's cell phone is gonna use a quantum computer. Like I think it's gonna be that would be a fantastic goal that I think we all have. My mom will finally be, I finally understand what you say, what you do, always told me about, and what you do. But I think it's always important to explain that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of risk, but also, I think something quantum computing has done, it has done a lot of the legwork to show the large impact it will have once we have those scalable computers. It is guaranteed that it's going to be transformative for some of this technology. So the way I always put it is like, well, I've been working in this field for a while, so I'm not so troubled if it's in 6 months or in 6 years or whatever, because it's exponential. That's really how I see it. This is going to be exponentially impact in some areas. And so don't come for 6 months of experience, come for the exponential impact. That's what I would say to people.
Yeah, awesome. We have another question, and this would be directed towards Cesar, because it's like how like for someone with like a complete like software experience, like how would you what would you recommend their direction to be in quantum computing?
Yeah, so I can speak a little about my own path in quantum computing. I used to be a software engineer, and 20 years ago I decided I wanted to program quantum computers, and everybody thought I was completely crazy back then. And so I decided to go get a PhD in physics, in theoretical physics, and now here I am programming quantum computers. So it was a lot of work to get to this point because people had to build the darn computers. They were too slow with that. But I would say you don't have to do that. You definitely don't have to do that. There is one way to think about quantum computing is that they are like a co-processor that's going to be very useful for some specific problems. And it is perfectly fine that maybe you don't understand all the details about how the algorithm works, but you do understand the inputs and outputs, what is useful, what are the costs, things like that. These are very standard part of software development, regardless. So I would say really treat it like this, like some other technology. Of course, at some point right now, because the hardware is very limited, if you want to improve on these things, improve their performance, then you really have to start getting into the physics, because you have to understand the devices, the limitations, and so on. But if you just wanna understand applications and so on, you can just do it with the code that's out there and just treat it in that way. This is a task that I can assign to something and get some output. I would say focus more on understanding the class of problems it's good at, and what is the code out there. Another source that I think is very, very useful is that because I want everybody to embrace open source community, is that a lot of this code is written by physicists like me, and we're terrible coders, by the way, if nobody knew. And there's a lot of benefit on just taking some of this code and really like making it production ready, like, which is a big difference, right? And there's all the foundations and other places to contribute this, and this is really contributing to the early libraries of this big field, for example. And this is definitely like a software engineering job. Like, it's something that we want software engineers to be doing, not physicists, because this it requires different skill set. So I would say those are some of the simple entry points. Talking, big perspective of angles that you can take.
Maybe I'll contribute something to that as well. The way we operate our team, we have a number of people who focus on researchy questions in quantum control, and sometimes they validate their techniques using hardware from our partners. But then we have other people who really focus on turning that capability into product. And as Cesar was just saying, there is a difference between science code, whether made by a PhD student or a industrial physicist, and production code. And that's not just about like how clean is it and is it well linted and whatever. It's about, how do we actually leverage classical computing to solve the problems that we care about. So as an example, like, we do a lot of numeric optimization. And so we built a whole bunch of our own optimization engines based on TensorFlow. And you can like do the physicist version, which is pretty cool. But then if you want to turn that into a really useful product, well, we wanted to be able to deploy HPC-like resource, high performance computing-like resourcing to users, but not have them, worry about managing a cluster or something like that. You just want to like code in Python and then get things in seconds instead of days, right? That's the outcome you want. And so how do we do that? Well, it turns out that you can do quite a lot of clever coding, starting with the core Python to use things called data flow graph objects, right? Which are a really convenient way to represent Hamiltonians for quantum systems, and then constraints and optimization targets and the like. And then they also map really well to the resourcing we see available from both TensorFlow and from the cloud compute community, right? That we can deploy, dozens of processors and GPUs and effectively unlimited memory if we have coded the problem the right way. Right. And it all starts with that. So there are many more people who've been joining our team lately who have not got a formal background in quantum physics or quantum control, but rather have a background in professional software engineering, and then have, dabbled and done some coursework to make them contextually aware of quantum computing. And then they learn the rest on the job. So I really, really want to encourage people who are interested in quantum computing, but come from a traditional software engineering background, that like, there is a home for you here, right? This is not just R&D shops practicing. When we're really making products, there's a huge value for the contributions that people like you make. So please talk to us. I don't know, maybe while Peter is scrolling on the questions, I want to give one slightly political statement. Open source is great. Open source should not be your filter for whether you use something or not. A lot of what we use is not open source on a day-to-day basis, PDF viewers, like all sorts of things. It's about choosing what tool is right for you. And I would say some of the purism that comes from academia is not necessarily helpful in advancing the whole field.
I guess going a little bit on that point, I was wondering, like, how does it compare for you guys working in industry versus academia? in terms of quantum computing, in terms of, you guys touched on it a bit, but in terms of collaborations, and kind of your projects, how oriented they are towards a product versus kind of pure understanding of the world around us, or like quantum computing in general.
I'm happy to go first. With my Q control hat on, we don't care how the world works, right? It's a company that's trying to solve problems and make, useful products to advance technology. In academia, the search is for truth, and we will do everything we can to exclude every possibility in order to get the truth. And in industry, or in startups in particular, it's about opportunity, right? Now, it's not opportunity at the expense of truth. It is not that. It is, however, opportunity, right? So, one thing that I find comes up a lot, and it's a useful lesson for people to learn. Sometimes students or academic teams will write to us and say, let's collaborate. But what does that mean? We don't do science for science sake. That's your job in academia, right? Understanding the world is the job of academics and fundamental scientists in general. Our job is to make products and to solve problems with those products. And so the idea of well, first of all, what one does, but then second, how does one engage with us? Like, look, I'm not able to have a full-time person who gets paid considerably more than an academic dedicated to a fun science project on the side, right? We all hope, I guess, that at some point we become like as big as Bell Labs was in the 70s, and you can do that. You can do that fundamental science in an industry setting. You can do it at sometimes Google or at IBM maybe. But when you're thinking about a startup, the idea of how you engage with us or what problems we work on is different, right? That we want to build new useful things, and part of that is moving as fast as possible. So it's not very common for us to get on a grant application that's going to take 6 months to submit, and then 9 months to be evaluated, and then 12 months of contract negotiation. That total amount of time is longer than the amount of capital runway that most startups will have. And so, for us, it's all about like, what can we solve that's big impact and exciting and deliverable on a rapid timescale? Very different approach.
Yes, I fully agree with Mike, and just saying the same thing, more succinct. Is like in academia, I was doing things to learn things, and now in industry, learning things to do things. That's basically it. So it's like there's still learning involved. There's still a lot of stuff, but it has to be to achieve something, create deliverable and useful for people. Ultimately, that's what matters, is that we make it useful.
Yeah, and just the same, basically, just transition from academia, where it was more about demonstrating how the world works, or how something works, versus going to industry, where you need to demonstrate how something is valuable. That's the biggest transition, I would say, in moving over to the industry.
All right, thank you for that. And we've rounded the hour. So if there are any last comments, in the interest of time, I think we'll end it here.
Great. It's an exciting field. Come join.
Yeah. And thank you guys for organizing, and thanks for everybody that participated and asked those questions.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thanks. See you.